sorry I'm getting these notes up so late. But better late than never. So these are pretty quick. So this is 4B8, the Imperial Presidency. And the phrase, the Imperial Presidency, comes from a guy named Arthur Schlesinger. And he wrote a book in 1973 that suggested that the president's power had just grown too large, too excessive, too imperial. What do you know about history to know what was going on in 1973 that somebody would say this about the president? Who was our president during this time that Arthur would say this? Do you remember? Richard Nixon. So it's no surprise maybe that there's a correlation there between this book being released and Nixon's presidency. All right. What did Schlesinger say was wrong with the way that the presidency had changed? Well, he's got different things such as war powers, emergency powers, executive agreements, executive privilege. But let's begin with war powers. Arthur said that there was a conflict in the Constitution regarding Congress's power to declare war versus the president's power as commander-in-chief, that these two things did not mesh well together. Back in the old days, 1700s, 1800s, Congress had more time to think about war issues, whether they wanted to go to war or not. You could take a few weeks to decide if you wanted to go to war because of the nature of things and how we were not, there was no planes and jet engines and you didn't have to have a rapid response necessarily. But because of modern technology, presidents have to be able to react swiftly, and because we give them more and more power, this ability to react swiftly, it's maybe overloaded the president, giving them even more power. For example, presidents have sent troops without Congress's approval, or without Congress's declaration of war, rather, 125 times. And this has happened a lot since 1945. Can you think of virtually everything after World War II is not a war? So, Korean War, not a war. Vietnam War, not a war. Operation Desert Storm, not a war. Iraq War, not a war. Afghanistan War, not a war. Even stuff like Clinton going to Kosovo, not a war. Alright, and now that being said, Congress has generally gone along with these operations. Of course, they're the ones that have to pay for them, so they could choose to not pay. And mostly they go along with what the president says, because as we learned in the other class, Congress tends to be okay with doing things with the president in regards to foreign policy. They're going to go along with them. It's a domestic affairs where Congress kind of differs of opinion. However, so Congress goes along with these little operations, but when the public turns against it, that's whenever Congress starts to respond, such as the Vietnam War. Do you guys remember whenever Syria had gassed their civilians? And there was really a lot of talk that we might get involved militarily, and then public opinion started to shift against our involvement, and Congress started to change their opinion and say we're against this thing too. So they are listening to public opinion when it comes to these things. One of the reasons why Congress has gone along with these, and why Congress doesn't declare war, is that when you declare war, you transfer an enormous amount of power to the president. I think this is an interesting note down here you might want to kind of highlight. When Congress declares war, they transfer an enormous amount of power to the president, and they want to avoid doing that unless it's absolutely necessary, unless there's a conflict like World War II. In which case, every aspect of American society revolves around war, that we have a total war situation. For example, when we go to war and it's declared in Congress, the president gains emergency powers. So, in time of war or emergency, the president gets great powers. An example of these kind of powers is suspension of habeas corpus. You can arrest somebody, keep them in jail without maybe giving them a reason as to why they're there. You can censor mail. You can censor television. You can control manufacturing. You can tell Ford automobile company stop making cars and start making tanks. You can change the way that communication and transportation occur. You can declare martial law, which means that Well, it's kind of complicated, but like the local officers are in charge of the law for the local town, and kind of anything goes, and they can change the rules if they need to. The Patriot Act would be involved. You can even analyze citizens' telephone records by the NSA. Oh wait, we're already doing that, and it's not times of war. Remember the topic that we're talking about here, that uh, why is today's presidency often called the Imperial Presidency? And another reason is the overuse of executive agreements rather than treaties. Remember, executive agreements do not require the Senate to ratify them. Um, so they're just kind of deals between the president and the head of another nation. An example some of you guys said in class, the Destroyers for Bases deal between FDR and Churchill in 1940. Since World War II, the number of executive agreements is way, 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 way higher than the number of treaties. So let's look at the last 100 years. There's been over 4,000 executive agreements and 200 treaties. And I'm sure you can guess why that is, because a treaty is a lot harder to get done. Just look at Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles. But at the same time, you're kind of going around the power of Congress by doing this. One thing that's interesting is the treaties that are passed now are about silly things, like archaeological artifacts in Mexico. We'll have a treaty between us and Mexico. But huge things like we're gonna train your military and sell you F-14s, or huge big agreements. Those are done with executive agreement, probably because they're a little more controversial, and the president doesn't want to do the treaty system. All right, executive privilege. So executive privilege is the right of the president not to have to talk, not to have to give away information about conversations that he has had between himself and his advisors. An example of this is Bush was asked who was on Dick Cheney's energy task force, and Bush refused to answer who it was. He wouldn't tell Congress. And generally speaking, in the course of history, it's been pretty accepted that the president does have executive privilege because of the separation of powers, and that he doesn't need to tell Congress what he's doing necessarily unless they're doing an investigation into criminal activity. So the president's claim that if such conversations were to be let out into the public or let out into Congress, that the people in his cabinet or the people that are his advisors would be hesitant to want to give him true advice. For instance, the NSA, they might say, if you want to catch terrorists, we need to sweep people's cell phone conversations. They might be nervous to give that advice to the president if they knew they could be called into court and have to testify. So they might give worse advice if they were thinking all the time about how will this sound later. But critics claim that the president has abused this privilege by always claiming, oh, I can't talk about the energy task force because it has to do with national security. So they basically always claim it has to do with national security, even in situations where it doesn't really have anything to do with national security. And we know from class that the court case U.S. v. Nixon in 1974 established that yes, the president does have executive privilege most of the time, but not if they're being investigated in a criminal case. All right, and this is already our last slide. So impoundment. Impoundment is a concept that's actually been around quite a while, since Jefferson's time. So when Congress passes a budget, let's say they give the president $1 trillion to spend, and let's say he's maybe a hardcore Republican president. He says, I really only need 800 billion. I don't need 1 trillion. He doesn't have the power of line item veto. We learned that. Clinton had it for a while, but they got rid of it. And a lot of times there's a lot of crap thrown into those bills that a president might not agree with, that he might find wasteful. And so some presidents, like Nixon, responded by impounding funds. So impoundment is like a vocab word. It's when the president refuses to spend money that Congress has appropriated to be spent on a budget. So certain presidents, for a while, they'd say, I'm not going to, I approve the budget, and yeah, I'm going to spend most of that money, but I'm not spending this and I'm spending that because I don't agree with it. Again, this is kind of like the line item veto, sort of. So you can imagine this kind of pissed off Congress, because they're like, this is our power, that's not your power. And it's not on here, But after Nixon was president, they passed a law that basically said the president no longer has the power of impoundment. You see here that it was kind of seemed a little unconstitutional, so they passed a law. I probably have it still up. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 was passed, and it basically said that no, you can't do impoundment anymore as a president. So, okay, that's it. Go ahead and answer the questions on the quiz, and I'll see you in class tomorrow. Adios.